Why does Jesus compare his return to the days of Noah, when there was eating, drinking, and marrying, right up to the time when the flood came and destroyed them all? We begin in Matthew chapter 24, verse 38. For as the days were before the flood, they were eating, drinking, and marrying, and giving in marriage, until the day Noah entered the ark, and knew not until the flood came and took them all away. So shall also the coming of the Son of Man be. So clearly Jesus expects us to go back to Genesis chapter 6, verse 1, where we read about marriages during the days of Noah. And it came to pass, when men began to multiply upon the earth, and the daughters were born unto them, that the sons of God saw the daughters of men, that they were fair, and they took them wives of all which they chose. Now, according to Exodus chapter 34, verse 15 through 16, the problem with marrying the daughters of men is that they inevitably lead God's people to worship other gods by eating sacrifices to them. Consequently, God warned in Genesis chapter 6, verse 3, that his Spirit, that is the Holy Spirit, would no longer strive with man. In other words, the Holy Spirit is no longer guiding those who were unequally yoked with unbelievers. As a result, the people of Noah's day did not know that the flood was coming within 120 years. Similarly, in 2 Peter chapter 3, we read that this present generation will be willfully ignorant of the flood as it relates to Judgment Day, when God will destroy this world with fire. Continuing in verse 4, we read that these unequally yoked marriages produced men of renown, some of whom became giants. There were giants in the earth in those days, and also after that, when the sons of God came unto the daughters of men, and they bare them children, the same became mighty men, which were of old, men of renown. It's important to note that the root word for giant means to fall, and throughout the Bible, giants were portrayed as instruments of violence who caused Israel to fall after disobeying God's commands. For example, in Numbers chapter 13, Israel was judged because she disobeyed God's command to take possession of the land of Canaan, which was inhabited by giants, the sons of Anak. And so the unequally yoked marriages that we read about in Genesis chapter 6 produced giants who were likely the cause of a preponderance of the violence that filled the earth in the days of Noah. The only thing standing in the way of these giants was Noah, a preacher of righteousness through whom Christ worked to preach the gospel to the spirits in prison. We begin in verse 18. For Christ also once suffered for sin, the just for the unjust, that he might bring us to God, being put to death in the flesh, but quickened by the Spirit. By which also he preached unto the spirits in prison, which sometime were disobedient, when once the long suffering of God waited in the days of Noah, while the ark was preparing, wherein few, that is 8 souls, were saved by water. And in verse 21, God compares the flood waters of Noah to baptism. No, he's not speaking about the water baptism, but he's referring to the baptism of the Holy Spirit, by which we are quickened or made alive after we are saved through the resurrection of Jesus Christ. This is the type of gospel that Noah preached over a period of 120 years, leading to the flood in 4990 BC. And as we learned in previous studies, this time of preaching liberty to the prisoners is observed at the end of every 7-year sabbaths. And therefore, we're not surprised to learn that the 120 years wherein Noah preached to the spirits in prison equates to 17 7-year cycles of sabbaths from 5110 BC to 4990 BC, when God destroyed the world with a flood. And to emphasize these Sabbaths, he gave Noah 7 days to enter the ark, the number 7 being focused on the Sabbaths. Similarly, at this present time, God's elect began to keep the Great Tribulation Sabbaths after leaving the church in the year 2000 AD because the church has been overrun by men of renown, spiritual giants like pastors, elders, and deacons who are unequally yoked with the rulers of the darkness of this world as they join forces to silence or censor the gospel. These rulers and spiritual giants are personified in Daniel chapter 11, where the king of the south, typified as the church, is joined to the king of the north, Satan the Antichrist, through his daughters, thus reminding us of unequally yoked marriages between the sons of God and daughters of men. For example, in verse 6 of Daniel 11 we read, "And in the end of days they shall join themselves together, for the king's daughter of the south shall come to the king of the north to make an agreement." And so the agreement is the beginning of this spiritual union. And to solidify this union, Satan gives the church the daughters of women to corrupt them. And it is through this corruption that Satan will cause many to fall. And remember, the root word for giant is the word fall. And so in verses 19 and 26, the fall is facilitated by violence, as we learned with the days of Noah. In verse 26 we read, "Yea, they shall feed the portion of his meat to destroy him, and his army shall overflow, and many shall fall down slain." And continuing in verses 30 through 32, Satan uses a combination of spiritual violence and flatteries, that is false doctrine, which inevitably cause the church to forsake God's holy covenant, replacing it with the abomination of desolation. In verse 30 we read, "For the ships of Chittim shall come against him. Therefore he shall be grieved and return and have indignation against the holy covenant. So shall he do. He shall even return and have intelligence with them that forsake the holy covenant." And then in verse 31 we read about the abomination of desolation. "An arm shall stand on his part, and they shall pollute the sanctuary of strength, and shall take away the daily sacrifice, and they shall place the abomination that maketh desolate." And remember, we learned from Matthew chapter 24 and Daniel chapter 12 that the 1,290 days of the abomination of desolation points to the year 1994. And in 1994, God loosed Satan to execute judgment on the church because she forsook his holy covenant. Now, continuing in verse 32 of Daniel chapter 11, we read, "And such as do wickedly against the covenant shall he corrupt by flatteries. But the people that do know their God shall be strong and do exploits." In other words, God's elect in the church will not be deceived by these flatteries. And that's why in Daniel chapter 34, we read that many will cleave to them, causing them to fall. But this is not the same word fall that is used in relation to giants. But God is simply informing us that the believers will face resistance as they take the gospel into the world. And during that time, many will cleave to them with flatteries. The word cleave reminding us that a wife cleaves to her husband. But in this case, the cleaving and the flatteries involve many in and outside the church who are working together to distort or disrupt the sending forth of the gospel, using flatteries, that is, false doctrines. Some will teach that we can become saved by our own works, while others teach that the hope of salvation is no longer possible. Unwittingly, they are joined with those outside the church who persecute the believers in an effort to shipwreck their faith so that they lose hope of salvation. And so, like the days of Noah, Daniel 11 is filled with a lot of violence, which causes many to fall. And so in the latter part of Daniel chapter 11, it appears as though Satan is winning on all fronts. But then in verse 44, we read that he is troubled by tidings from the east and the north. But tidings out of the east and out of the north shall trouble him. Therefore he shall go forth with great fury to destroy and utterly to make away many. He shall plant the tabernacles of his palace between the seas and the glorious holy mountain, yet he shall come to his end, and none shall help him. Undoubtedly, the tidings refer to the good news of the gospel, which comes from the east to the north, which is the deepest and most fortified parts of Satan's dominion. And yet God is informing us that the gospel will penetrate those prisons where God's elect were taken captive by Satan and sin. And so this time of release comes after 2,300 days. That is from 1994, when the abomination of desolation was set up, to the year 2000 AD, when God's elect began to cleanse their sanctuaries from all of the idols that were brought in by the daughters of men. And so, as we learned previously, the year 2000 AD is the beginning of the 4 7-year cycles of sabbaths, when God's elect go forth to preach a gospel that provides liberty from Satan and sin. These sabbaths are much like the 120 years, which consist of 17 cycles of sabbaths, during which Noah preached the gospel to the spirits in prison. And as we learned in Hebrews chapter 11, verse 7, as he preached the gospel, he condemned the world. And in our next study, we're going to learn that the condemnation came upon the world because the church was unequally yoked with unbelievers, joined together in fellowship and communion, that is, eating and drinking, at a table of devils. And so Jesus is using the eating, drinking, and marrying during the days of Noah to warn us that there will be a spiritual union between the rulers of the darkness of this world and the church to silence the gospel. In this respect, the church marshaled all of its forces against the believers to excommunicate them. And once outside the church, the spiritual giants of government, academia, and business will develop laws and mandates designed to silence the gospel. But as in the days of Noah, these mighty men will fail miserably. And we know this from Revelation chapter 6, where we read that the mighty men will attempt to hide themselves in the rocks and the caves of the mountains from the wrath of the Lamb, even as they probably attempted to hide upon the mountains of Ararat from the flood before they were overwhelmed. Finally, 2 Peter chapter 3 suggests that the timeline of Noah's flood points to Judgment Day. And we know from Genesis chapters 7 and 8 that the flood began and ended on the 17th day. And so we're not surprised when we go from 4990 BC, when the flood came, to the year 2028 is 7,017 years, again emphasizing the number 17. Moreover, 2 Peter chapter 3 also implores us to apply the day for 1,000 years, which likely points to the fact that God commanded Noah to enter the ark after 7 days, meaning that judgment would come shortly after 7,000 years, possibly 7,017 years from the flood in 4990 BC to the year 2028. And we learned some time ago that the year 2028 is important because Psalm chapter 90 verse 10 reveals that God gave the fig tree of 1948 70 to 80 years to produce the fruits of salvation before we fly away, that is, before we are raptured. Now, when we consider the context of Psalm chapter 90, we are amazed to find that God not only mentions the day for 1,000-year principle, but also the flood. In verses 4 through 5 of Psalm chapter 90, we read, "For 1,000 years in thy sight are but as yesterday, when it is past as a watch in the night. Thou carriest them away as with a flood." And so we should not be surprised to read in Matthew chapter 24 that Jesus used both the sign of the fig tree and Noah's flood as signs of his return. And it appears that Christ will return sometime shortly before or in the year 2028.